The courthouse steps were slick with morning rain as I climbed them one last time, wearing what everyone would soon mock as my costume. Little did they know, this wasn't dress-up. This was who I really was. And in less than an hour, a federal judge would stand and change everything. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The security guard at the metal detector looked me up and down with barely concealed amusement. My dress blues were immaculate. Every ribbon precisely placed, every crease sharp enough to cut paper, shoes polished to a mirror finish. But here in downtown Phoenix, walking into the federal courthouse at 8:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, I might as well have been wearing a clown suit. "Halloween's not for another 6 months, buddy," the guard chuckled, running his wand over my uniform. The other guards joined in the laughter. "What are you supposed to be, some kind of war hero?" I said nothing, just collected my items from the plastic bin and walked toward the elevator. The marble floors echoed with my footsteps, each one measured and precise, a habit that 28 years of service had burned into my muscle memory. The elevator was crowded with lawyers in expensive suits, their briefcases clicking against the walls as they whispered about their cases. When I stepped in, conversation stopped. A woman in a Chanel jacket nudged her colleague and gestured toward my chest full of ribbons. "Is he serious right now?" she whispered, not bothering to lower her voice. "Who wears a military dress uniform to civil court? Talk about desperate for attention." Her companion, a silver-haired man with wire-rimmed glasses, shook his head in disgust. "Probably some wannabe trying to get sympathy from the judge. I've seen it before. Stolen valor cases always dress up like they're some kind of Medal of Honor recipient." The elevator dinged at the 3rd floor, and I stepped out into the hallway. Behind me, I heard the woman say, "Did you see all those fake ribbons?" As if anyone would believe he earned half of those. Room 312 was buzzing with activity. This was the preliminary hearing for the Henderson Development Group lawsuit, a case that had been making headlines for months. HDG was suing the city of Phoenix over a blocked construction project, claiming the mayor's office had overstepped its authority in halting development of what they called luxury residential towers. What the newspapers didn't know was that those towers were supposed to be built on land that held something far more valuable than real estate. I took a seat in the back row, straightening my jacket as whispers rippled through the courtroom. The plaintiff's legal team, 5 lawyers from Morrison, Blake & Associates, kept glancing back at me with expressions ranging from confusion to outright mockery. "Your Honor," the lead attorney was saying to the bailiff, "I have to ask, is there some kind of costume party I wasn't informed about? Because that gentleman in the back appears to be dressed for Comic-Con." The bailiff, a tired-looking man in his 50s, just shrugged. "As long as he's not disrupting proceedings, he can wear whatever he wants." Sarah Mitchell, HDG's primary counsel, turned fully around to stare at me. She was the kind of lawyer who commanded rooms. Harvard Law, 20 years of high-profile wins, a reputation for destroying opponents with surgical precision. Her eyes swept over my uniform with the same attention she'd give a piece of evidence she was about to shred. "Gentlemen," she said to her team, "it looks like the city's brought in some creative consulting today. I wonder if they think military cosplay is going to influence federal court proceedings." More laughter. The court reporter looked up from her machine with raised eyebrows. Even the stenographer seemed to think I was some kind of sideshow. At exactly 9 a.m., the bailiff stood. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Hawkins." Judge Hawkins entered with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd been managing courtrooms for over 2 decades. She was a small woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of no-nonsense expression that suggested she'd seen every trick in the book. She settled behind the bench, opened her folder, and began reviewing the case summary. That's when her eyes found me in the back row. For a moment, she paused. Her expression shifted, not with amusement like the others, but with something else. Recognition? Surprise? It was hard to tell. "Before we begin," Judge Hawkins said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "I'd like to note for the record that we have a distinguished visitor with us today." Sarah Mitchell leaned forward, probably expecting the judge to dress down whoever was disrupting her courtroom with inappropriate attire. The aftermath of Judge Hawkins's announcement hit the courtroom like a shockwave. Sarah Mitchell's briefcase slipped from her hands, scattering papers across the polished floor. The lead attorney from Morrison, Blake and Associates gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles white against the dark wood. But the real drama was just beginning. Judge Hawkins gestured for everyone to be seated, but her eyes remained fixed on me with a mixture of professional respect and something else, something that suggested our paths had crossed before. "General Patterson," she said, "before we proceed with the matter at hand, I believe the court would benefit from understanding the full scope of your authority in this case." I nodded, reaching into my jacket for a second set of documents. "Your Honor, the Western Archaeological Preservation Unit operates under joint jurisdiction between the Department of Defense and the Department of the Interior. What that means, in practical terms, is that any decision I make regarding protected sites carries the full weight of federal law." HDG's CEO, Marcus Henderson, had been sitting in the front row throughout the proceedings. Until now, he'd maintained the confident posture of a man who'd never lost a legal battle. His company had steamrolled through environmental reviews, city council meetings, and zoning disputes with the casual efficiency of a bulldozer. But as my words sank in, his face began to change. "Furthermore," I continued, "the Army Corps of Engineers has been monitoring this site since 1987. Every permit application, every survey request, every preliminary assessment that Henderson Development Group has filed over the past 3 years has crossed my desk." Henderson shot to his feet. "That's impossible! We never received any correspondence from the military. No notifications, no objections, nothing." Judge Hawkins raised her hand for silence. "Mr. Henderson, you'll have your opportunity to speak. General, please continue." "The reason Mr. Henderson never received direct correspondence," I explained, "is because his applications never met the threshold for approval. Under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, any federal agency, including the Army, can halt development that might impact protected sites. We didn't need to notify HDG because their project was dead in the water from day one." Sarah Mitchell finally found her voice. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. If the Army had concerns about our client's development plans, proper legal channels should have been followed. We should have been notified of any federal oversight." "Ms. Mitchell," I said, turning to face her directly, "your firm never requested a federal archaeological survey. Your environmental impact assessment was conducted by Green Tech Solutions, a private company with no federal clearance. If you had followed proper procedures and contacted the appropriate federal agencies, you would have been told immediately that development was impossible." The color drained from her face. Green Tech Solutions was HDG's go-to environmental consulting firm, a company known for fast turnarounds and findings that rarely complicated development projects. Sarah had recommended them specifically because they had a reputation for smooth approvals. "What General Patterson is telling us," Judge Hawkins interjected, "is that your client attempted to bypass federal oversight entirely. Is that correct, General?" "That's correct, Your Honor. HDG filed applications with the City of Phoenix, Maricopa County, and the state of Arizona. They never contacted the Bureau of Land Management, the Army Corps of Engineers, or the National Park Service. It's as if they were hoping no one in the federal government would notice a 47-acre development project." Henderson was back on his feet, his voice rising. "This is harassment. We followed every legal requirement. We paid for surveys, impact studies, traffic assessments." "Mr. Henderson," I interrupted, "did you ever wonder why that land was available for purchase at such a low price? 47 acres in prime Phoenix real estate, selling for 60% below market value?" The question hit its mark. Henderson's mouth opened, then closed. His legal team exchanged glances that confirmed what I already knew. They'd celebrated the bargain without ever questioning why it existed. "The previous owner," I continued, "was Southwest Desert Holdings, a subsidiary of Pinnacle Real Estate Group. They purchased the land in 1995 with plans for a shopping complex. After 18 months of planning and preliminary work, they abandoned the project. Do you know why?" Sarah Mitchell was frantically taking notes, probably realizing that her firm's due diligence had missed something crucial. "They discovered what we're discussing today," I said, "the archaeological significance. But in 1995, the federal designation process was different. The Army worked with Southwest Desert Holdings to quietly shelve the project in exchange for tax considerations and development rights elsewhere. The land sat empty for 30 years, waiting for someone who would do proper federal research before attempting development. Quote, Judge Hawkins leaned forward. General, you mentioned that the information was classified until this morning. Can you explain the declassification process? Certainly, Your Honor. The Hohokam settlement we discovered includes burial sites and ceremonial structures. Under federal law and tribal sovereignty agreements, we needed approval from the Tohono O'odham Nation before making our findings public. That process took 17 years of negotiation, cultural consultation, and legal review. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I pulled out a third document, this one bearing multiple official seals and signatures. As of 0800 hours this morning, the Tohono O'odham Tribal Council formally agreed to public disclosure of the site, provided that access remains strictly controlled and the land receives permanent federal protection. This document represents not just Army approval, but tribal sovereignty recognition and Interior Department certification. Henderson's attorney, a young man who'd been quiet throughout the proceedings, finally spoke up. Your Honor, even if this archaeological site exists, surely there's some form of compensation available for my client. HDG has invested millions in planning, surveys, and legal fees. I almost smiled. Counselor, your client purchased land that was explicitly marked in county records as, quote, pending federal review. The deed includes language stating that development rights are, quote, subject to federal archaeological clearance. Mr. Henderson signed documents acknowledging this restriction. Sarah Mitchell's head snapped up. That's impossible. I reviewed every piece of paperwork myself. Page 47 of the purchase agreement, I said calmly. Subsection 12C. The language is buried in legal terminology, but it's there. HDG's own real estate attorneys signed off on a deal that explicitly made development contingent on federal approval that was never going to come. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Henderson looked like a man watching his fortune evaporate in real time. His development company had built its reputation on aggressive expansion and profitable risk-taking, but they'd just discovered that some risks come with consequences they never imagined. Judge Hawkins reviewed the documents I'd presented, her expression growing more grave with each page. General Patterson, what happens to the land now? The site will be transferred to joint custody between the National Park Service and the Tohono O'odham Nation. It will be developed as an educational and cultural center, with controlled access for archaeological research. The settlement we've uncovered includes intact pottery, tool-making areas, and evidence of trade relationships that extend from present-day Mexico to Colorado. It's one of the most significant prehistoric sites ever discovered in the Southwest. Marcus Henderson finally sat down, his head in his hands. 3 years of planning, millions in investment, and legal fees that had already reached 7 figures, all for a piece of land that he never legally had the right to develop. But Judge Hawkins wasn't finished. She looked at Sarah Mitchell with the expression of someone who'd seen too many attorneys cut corners over the years. Ms. Mitchell, I'm curious about your firm's due diligence process. Did Morrison, Blake & Associates conduct any federal compliance research before taking on HDG as a client? Sarah's answer came out as barely a whisper. We relied on the environmental assessments provided by the client. So you filed a federal lawsuit challenging the City of Phoenix's authority to halt development, without ever verifying whether federal agencies had jurisdiction over the land in question. The implications were staggering. Morrison, Blake & Associates hadn't just failed their client. They'd filed a frivolous lawsuit in federal court, wasting judicial resources and potentially exposing themselves to sanctions. Judge Hawkins closed the folder in front of her. General Patterson, I believe we have sufficient information to resolve this matter. However, I suspect there's more to this story than archaeological protection. What else should this court know? Instead, Judge Hawkins continued, would Colonel James Patterson please approach the bench? The silence that followed was deafening. I stood, every movement deliberate and precise, and walked down the center aisle. Behind me, I could hear the shuffle of bodies turning in seats, the whispered, "What did she just say?" from the lawyer who'd called my ribbons fake. "Your Honor," I said, stopping at the appropriate distance from the bench. "Colonel Patterson," Judge Hawkins said, and her voice had taken on a tone of unmistakable respect. "I believe you have something important to share with this court regarding the Henderson Development Group case?" Sarah Mitchell was on her feet immediately. "Your Honor, I object to whatever theatrical display this is. My client has rights, and we're not going to be intimidated by—" "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Hawkins cut her off, "I suggest you listen very carefully to what the Colonel has to say. It directly impacts your client's case." I reached into my jacket and withdrew a sealed envelope. "Your Honor, I'm here to present classified documents that have been declassified as of this morning at 0800 hours. These documents pertain to the land in question in Henderson Development Group versus City of Phoenix." The courtroom was dead silent now. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. "The land that HDG wishes to develop," I continued, "is currently designated as a protected archaeological site under federal jurisdiction. What Mr. Henderson and his investors don't realize is that in 1987, during a routine Army Corps of Engineers survey, we discovered something beneath that property that makes construction impossible." Sarah Mitchell's face had gone pale. Her team was frantically shuffling through their files, looking for any mention of federal jurisdiction or archaeological surveys. "Furthermore," I said, breaking the seal on the envelope, "the U.S. Army has maintained oversight of this site for 38 years. As the commanding officer of the Western Archaeological Preservation Unit, I have direct authority over any development requests for this land." Judge Hawkins nodded. "And what did your survey discover, Colonel?" "An intact Hohokam settlement, Your Honor, dating back approximately 1,200 years. The site contains ceremonial structures, burial grounds, and artifacts that make it one of the most significant archaeological finds in the Southwest. Under federal law, this land cannot be developed, ever." The lead attorney from Morrison, Blake and Associates stood up shakily. "Your Honor, we were never informed of any federal oversight or archaeological." "That's because," I interrupted, "the information was classified until this morning. The Army has been conducting additional surveys and working with the Tohono O'odham Nation to determine the full extent of the site. As of today, the entire 47-acre plot is officially designated as a National Historic Landmark." Sarah Mitchell sank into her chair. 47 acres. Her client had been fighting for permission to build luxury towers on land that was now untouchable by federal law. "Your Honor," she said weakly, "we had no knowledge of any archaeological significance. Our environmental impact studies showed nothing." "Your environmental impact studies," I said, "were conducted on the surface. The Hohokam settlement is buried 15 feet below ground level. It took us 3 decades of careful excavation to map the full site." Judge Hawkins looked down at the papers I'd handed her. "Colonel, these documents appear to be in order. The federal designation takes precedence over local zoning laws, correct?" "That's correct, Your Honor. The Henderson Development Group's lawsuit is now moot. The City of Phoenix acted within its rights when it blocked construction, though they didn't know at the time about the federal designation." The woman in the Chanel jacket who'd mocked me in the elevator was staring with her mouth open. The security guards who'd laughed at my costume were probably watching on the courtroom's closed-circuit feed, realizing they'd just made fun of a full-bird colonel. But the real shock was yet to come. Judge Hawkins stood, and the entire courtroom automatically rose with her. But instead of dismissing the court, she remained standing. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "I need to make a correction to the record. I introduced our visitor as Colonel Patterson. However, as of last Friday, that rank is no longer accurate." She looked directly at me, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, she smiled. "All rise for General Patterson." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, it began to sink in. The lawyers who'd been whispering about my fake ribbons, the guards who'd made Halloween jokes, the people who'd assumed I was just another attention-seeking pretender, they were all staring at a newly promoted brigadier general in the United States Army. A general who'd just single-handedly destroyed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit and turned 47 acres of prime Phoenix real estate into untouchable federal land. Judge Hawkins' question hung in the air like a challenge. The courtroom had grown so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. I looked at Marcus Henderson, then at Sarah Mitchell, and finally back at the judge, who clearly knew more about this case than she'd initially let on. Your Honor, I began, what this court should know is that the Henderson Development Group lawsuit isn't really about zoning disputes or municipal overreach. It's about something much more serious. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a thick manila folder marked with red classification stamps. Even though the contents had been declassified that morning, the visual impact of those security markings sent a ripple through the courtroom. In 1987, when the Army Corps of Engineers first surveyed this land, we weren't looking for archaeological sites. We were investigating reports of illegal dumping. Specifically, reports that industrial waste, including hazardous chemicals, had been buried on the property during the 1970s. Henderson's face went ashen. Sarah Mitchell's pen clattered to the floor. What we found, I continued, was far more complex. Yes, we discovered the Hohokam settlement, but we also found evidence of deliberate contamination. Between 1974 and 1979, Phoenix Industrial Solutions used this land as an unauthorized disposal site for chemical waste from their manufacturing operations. Judge Hawkins nodded grimly. And Phoenix Industrial Solutions was? A subsidiary of Henderson Manufacturing Group, I said, watching Marcus Henderson's reaction carefully. Marcus Henderson's father, Robert Henderson, owned the company that poisoned this land 45 years ago. The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Henderson shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger and panic. That's a lie. My father's company was cleared of all charges. The EPA investigation found no evidence of wrongdoing. Mr. Henderson, I said calmly, your father's company was cleared because the EPA investigation in 1979 was based on falsified soil samples. The real samples, the ones that showed dangerous levels of mercury, lead, and industrial solvents, were hidden in Army Corps of Engineers files for 45 years. I opened the folder and pulled out a series of photographs and lab reports. These are soil composition analyses from 12 different locations across the 47-acre site. Every single sample shows contamination levels that exceed federal safety standards by factors of 10 to 50. Sarah Mitchell was frantically whispering to her associates, probably trying to figure out how this information had never surfaced during their preparation. But the worst was yet to come. Furthermore, I continued, our geological surveys show that the contamination has been spreading. Groundwater beneath the site has been carrying industrial toxins toward the Phoenix metropolitan water supply for 4 decades. The city of Phoenix didn't just halt HDG's development to protect archaeological sites. They halted it because digging would have released a toxic plume that could have contaminated drinking water for 2 million people. The implications were staggering. Henderson wasn't just trying to build luxury towers on sacred land. He was unknowingly attempting to develop a site that his own family had turned into an environmental disaster. Judge Hawkins studied the lab reports I'd handed her. General Patterson, are you telling this court that the Henderson family has been aware of this contamination? No, Your Honor. Our investigation suggests that Marcus Henderson had no knowledge of his father's actions. However, the same cannot be said for everyone involved in this development project. I turned to face the plaintiff's table, where Sarah Mitchell was looking increasingly desperate. Ms. Mitchell, your firm conducted extensive research into the property's history before taking on HDG as a client. Did that research include a review of EPA files from the 1970s? We conducted standard due diligence, she stammered. Property records, zoning history, tax assessments. But not environmental history, I pressed. Which is interesting because 3 months ago, your firm received a phone call from Dr. Rebecca Chen at the Environmental Protection Agency. Dr. Chen specifically warned Morrison, Blake, and Associates that the Henderson property had, quote, potential environmental concerns, and recommended a comprehensive soil analysis before proceeding with any legal action. Sarah Mitchell's face went white. Around the courtroom, reporters were scribbling frantically, sensing that this story was becoming much bigger than a simple zoning dispute. General, Judge Hawkins interjected, how do you know about this phone call? Because Dr. Chen is a colleague of mine, Your Honor. We've worked together on environmental remediation projects for the past 15 years. When she learned that HDG was planning a major excavation on the Henderson property, she alerted both my office and HDG's legal team. My office took action. HDG's legal team did not. I pulled out a phone record from the folder. This is a log of Dr. Chen's call to Morrison, Blake & Associates on April 15th of this year. The call lasted 14 minutes. Ms. Mitchell personally took the call and was specifically advised to halt all development plans pending environmental review. Sarah Mitchell was shaking her head, but her denials lacked conviction. That call was advisory only. Dr. Chen didn't provide any concrete evidence of contamination. Ms. Mitchell, I said, Dr. Chen offered to provide your firm with preliminary soil samples and EPA historical records. You declined, stating that environmental concerns were outside the scope of your legal strategy. Judge Hawkins leaned back in her chair, clearly processing the magnitude of what she was hearing. So let me understand this correctly, General. The Army has known about both archaeological and environmental issues with this land for decades. The EPA warned the plaintiff's attorneys about potential contamination. And yet, Henderson Development Group proceeded with a federal lawsuit claiming their rights were being violated? That's correct, Your Honor. But there's one more element that this court needs to understand. I reached for the final document in my folder, a memorandum bearing the seal of the Department of Justice. 2 weeks ago, the Environmental Protection Agency formally notified the Department of Justice that Morrison, Blake & Associates may have violated federal environmental disclosure laws by proceeding with litigation, despite being warned about potential contamination. The DOJ has opened a preliminary investigation into whether the firm knowingly filed a frivolous lawsuit in federal court. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah Mitchell looked like she was going to be sick. Her associates were frantically packing their briefcases, probably already thinking about damage control and malpractice insurance. But Marcus Henderson was staring at me with a different expression, not anger or panic, but something closer to curiosity. General Patterson, he said quietly, how long have you known about my father's company? Since 1987, Mr. Henderson, but we also know that you've spent the last 3 years trying to make this right. Henderson's attorneys looked confused, but I continued. What your legal team doesn't know, Mr. Henderson, is that you've been secretly funding environmental cleanup research through your personal foundation. You've donated over $2 million to soil remediation projects across Arizona, specifically targeting sites contaminated by industrial waste from the 1970s. Henderson nodded slowly. I suspected something was wrong with that land. My father, he wasn't always honest about his business practices. When I started HDG, I made a commitment to environmental responsibility, but I never connected his old company to the property I wanted to develop. Judge Hawkins looked intrigued. General, are you suggesting that Mr. Henderson's development plans were motivated by something other than profit? Your Honor, Marcus Henderson has been trying to purchase contaminated properties throughout Phoenix with the intention of cleaning them up and redeveloping them responsibly. His mistake was trusting legal counsel who prioritized aggressive litigation over thorough environmental review. I pulled out one final document, a detailed proposal that Henderson's engineers had prepared months before the lawsuit began. This is HDG's original development plan, filed with their architectural firm in January. Phase 1 called for comprehensive soil remediation and groundwater treatment. Phase 2 included the construction of a community environmental education center. The luxury towers were actually Phase 3, intended to generate revenue to fund ongoing cleanup efforts. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Henderson wasn't the villain of this story. He was trying to fix his father's mistakes. The real problem was a legal team that had prioritized winning over understanding what they were actually fighting for. Judge Hawkins studied the proposal with growing interest. Mr. Henderson, is this accurate? Were you planning to clean up the contamination before development? Henderson stood, his voice steady for the first time since the hearing began. Yes, Your Honor. I've known for years that my father's company caused environmental damage throughout Phoenix. I started HDG specifically to address those problems. But when the city blocked my permits, my attorneys convinced me that aggressive litigation was the only way forward. He turned to look at Sarah Mitchell, his expression a mixture of disappointment and anger. What I didn't know was that they'd been warned about federal oversight and chose to ignore it. Judge Hawkins closed the file in front of her and looked around the courtroom. The case that had started as a simple development dispute had transformed into something much more complex. A story of family legacy, environmental responsibility, and legal malpractice that would have consequences far beyond this courtroom. General Patterson, she said finally, what does the Army recommend as the appropriate resolution to this matter? Judge Hawkins' question about the Army's recommendation hung in the courtroom air, but before I could answer, something unexpected happened. The courtroom doors opened, and Dr. Rebecca Chen from the EPA entered, followed by two men in dark suits who had the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. Your Honor, Dr. Chen announced, I apologize for the interruption, but recent developments require immediate court attention. Judge Hawkins frowned. Dr. Chen, this is highly irregular. We're in the middle of proceedings. Your Honor, I believe General Patterson can explain why my presence is necessary. All eyes turned to me. This wasn't part of the original plan, but Dr. Chen's arrival meant that the situation had escalated beyond what even I had anticipated. Your Honor, I said, Dr. Chen's presence indicates that the EPA has made a determination about the contamination level that requires immediate action. I believe she's here to deliver a federal emergency declaration. Dr. Chen nodded grimly. That's correct, General. Based on the soil samples and groundwater analysis that General Patterson's team provided to us yesterday, the EPA has classified the Henderson property as a Superfund site. As of 2 hours ago, the entire area has been designated for immediate federal remediation under the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. The courtroom erupted. A Superfund designation meant the contamination was severe enough to pose an immediate threat to public health. It also meant that the federal government would take control of the property, regardless of who owned it. Marcus Henderson looked stunned. What does that mean for my company? One of the federal agents stepped forward. Mr. Henderson, I'm Agent Michael Torres from the Environmental Crimes Unit. We're not here to arrest you. Our investigation has confirmed that you had no knowledge of the original contamination. However, we do need to discuss your cooperation with the federal cleanup effort. Sarah Mitchell finally found her voice again, though it came out as a croak. Your Honor, my client had no knowledge of any Superfund designation when we filed this lawsuit. Ms. Mitchell, Agent Torres said, that's actually part of the problem. Our investigation shows that your firm received multiple warnings about environmental concerns and chose to proceed with litigation anyway. That raises questions about whether Morrison, Blake, and Associates knowingly filed a frivolous lawsuit in federal court. The second agent, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. I'm Agent Lisa Rodriguez, also with the Environmental Crimes Unit. Ms. Mitchell, we need to inform you that your firm is under federal investigation for potential violations of environmental disclosure laws and obstruction of federal environmental enforcement. Judge Hawkins held up her hand for silence. Agents, while I appreciate the gravity of this situation, I need to complete the proceedings before us. Dr. Chen, what does the Superfund designation mean for this lawsuit? Your Honor, it means the lawsuit is moot. Under federal law, once a site receives Superfund designation, all private development rights are suspended indefinitely. The land belongs to the federal government until remediation is complete, which typically takes between 10 and 30 years. Marcus Henderson buried his face in his hands. 3 years of planning, millions of dollars invested, and now his property had been seized by the federal government. But Dr. Chen wasn't finished. However, she continued, there is an unusual aspect to this case. Mr. Henderson's development plans actually align with EPA remediation goals. His proposal for soil treatment and groundwater cleanup could accelerate the Superfund process significantly. Judge Hawkins looked intrigued. Are you suggesting some form of public-private partnership? Before Dr. Chen could answer, I stepped forward. Your Honor, that brings us to the real reason I'm here today. The Army's recommendation isn't just about resolving this lawsuit. It's about proposing a solution that serves justice, environmental protection, and community benefit. I pulled out a final folder, this one containing documents that had been prepared in coordination with multiple federal agencies. General Patterson, Judge Hawkins said, please proceed with your recommendation. Your Honor, the Army proposes a 3-phase resolution. Phase 1. Henderson Development Group enters into a consent agreement with the EPA to fund and oversee environmental remediation of the contaminated site. This would cost approximately $15 million over 5 years. Marcus Henderson looked up sharply. $15 million? That's more than the entire development project was supposed to cost. Phase 2, I continued, involves converting the remediated land into a joint cultural and environmental education center managed in partnership with the Tohono O'odham Nation. The archaeological site would be preserved and made accessible for research and education, while the environmental cleanup serves as a model for industrial remediation projects. Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. This approach would turn a contaminated Superfund site into a showcase for environmental restoration. And Phase 3? Judge Hawkins asked. Phase 3 involves Morrison, Blake, and Associates paying substantial fines to the EPA for environmental disclosure violations, with those funds going directly to support the cleanup effort. Additionally, the firm would be required to establish a pro bono environmental law clinic to ensure that future development projects receive proper environmental review. Sarah Mitchell stood up shakily. Your Honor, we haven't been convicted of any violations. These are still allegations. Agent Rodriguez interrupted her. Ms. Mitchell, we have recorded phone conversations, email correspondence, and documented evidence that your firm ignored EPA warnings. The investigation is complete. The question now is whether you want to cooperate with the proposed resolution or face federal prosecution. The weight of the situation finally seemed to hit Sarah Mitchell. Her firm faced potential criminal charges, massive fines, and professional sanctions. The proposed resolution, while expensive, was probably the best outcome she could hope for. Marcus Henderson, meanwhile, was staring at the documents I'd presented. Generally, if I agree to this plan, what happens to my company? Mr. Henderson, your company becomes the primary contractor for one of the most ambitious environmental remediation projects in Arizona history. You'll work directly with the EPA, the Army Corps of Engineers, and tribal environmental specialists to clean up contamination that has threatened Phoenix's water supply for 45 years. I paused, letting that sink in. Instead of building luxury towers for wealthy buyers, you'll be cleaning up your father's mess and creating something that benefits the entire community. It's not the project you planned, but it might be the project Phoenix actually needs. Henderson was quiet for a long moment, processing the enormity of what was being proposed. Finally, he looked up at Judge Hawkins. Your Honor, I accept the Army's recommendation. My company will fund the cleanup, work with the tribal authorities, and help create the education center. It's what I should have been doing from the beginning. Quote. Judge Hawkins turned to Sarah Mitchell. Ms. Mitchell, what is your firm's position on the proposed resolution? Sarah looked at her associates, then at the federal agents, and finally at the ruins of what had once been a high-profile case. Your Honor, Morrison, Blake, and Associates accepts the terms of the resolution. We'll pay the EPA fines and establish the environmental law clinic. Dr. Chen stepped forward. Your Honor, there's one more element to this resolution that General Patterson hasn't mentioned yet. Judge Hawkins raised an eyebrow. What's that, Dr. Chen? The Tohono O'odham Nation has agreed to name the Cultural and Environmental Center after General Patterson, in recognition of his decades of work protecting both archaeological sites and environmental resources. The Patterson Center for Cultural and Environmental Preservation will serve as a model for how industrial contamination sites can be transformed into community resources. The courtroom fell silent as the full scope of the resolution became clear. What had started as a contentious lawsuit about development rights had become a comprehensive plan for environmental justice, cultural preservation, and community healing. Judge Hawkins looked around the courtroom one final time. This case represents one of the most complex resolutions I've seen in 25 years on the bench. Environmental law, archaeological preservation, corporate responsibility, legal ethics, and tribal sovereignty, all wrapped up in a single dispute. She stood, and the courtroom automatically rose with her. The court accepts the proposed resolution. Mr. Henderson, your company will begin environmental remediation within 60 days. Ms. Mitchell, your firm will pay EPA fines totaling $3 million and establish the Environmental Law Clinic within 6 months. The land will be transferred to joint federal and tribal custody for the creation of the Patterson Center. She paused, looking directly at me. General Patterson, this court commends you for turning what could have been a destructive legal battle into an opportunity for environmental and social justice. Your service to this community extends far beyond your military duties. As the judge left the bench and the courtroom began to empty, Marcus Henderson approached me. General, I have to ask, how long have you been planning this resolution? I smiled. Mr. Henderson, I've been working on this problem since 1987. It just took 38 years to find someone willing to help fix it. The security guards who had mocked my uniform that morning were nowhere to be seen. The lawyers who had whispered about my fake ribbons were packing their briefcases in silence. And the woman in the Chanel jacket from the elevator was staring at me with an expression of pure amazement. Sometimes justice comes in the form of a gavel and a verdict. But sometimes it comes in the form of a general who refuses to let old wrongs remain buried, and who finds a way to turn legal warfare into community healing. The Patterson Center for Cultural and Environmental Preservation would break ground in 18 months. And for the first time in 45 years, the land that had been poisoned by corporate greed would serve the community it had once threatened to destroy. 3 months after the court resolution, I stood in the same federal courthouse, but this time I wasn't alone. The hallway buzzed with activity as reporters, environmental scientists, tribal leaders, and government officials gathered for what the media had dubbed the most significant environmental justice ceremony in Arizona history. Marcus Henderson approached me near the elevator, the same elevator where lawyers had once mocked my uniform. Now he wore a hard hat, emblazoned with Henderson Environmental Solutions, and carried blueprints for the remediation project that would define his company's future. General, I wanted to thank you again before the ceremony begins, he said, extending his hand. 6 months ago, I thought you were here to destroy my company. I had no idea you were here to save it. Mr. Henderson, you saved your own company by choosing to do the right thing. I just provided the information you needed to make that choice. The transformation in Henderson had been remarkable. After accepting the EPA agreement, he'd restructured his entire business model around environmental remediation. Henderson Environmental Solutions now employed 73 people, including 15 former employees of Phoenix Industrial Solutions, workers who'd been laid off when his father's company was shut down in 1979. The symmetry wasn't lost on anyone. Dr. Rebecca Chen emerged from the courthouse conference room where she'd been briefing federal officials on the project's progress. General Patterson, we're ready for the presentation. I think you'll be impressed with what we've accomplished. Quote, the past 3 months had moved with unprecedented speed for a federal environmental project. Henderson's company had completed Phase 1 soil analysis ahead of schedule, confirming that the contamination was even more extensive than originally estimated. But they'd also proven that their innovative remediation techniques could clean up the site in 7 years, instead of the projected 15. As we entered the courthouse conference room, I was struck by the diverse group assembled around the massive oak table. Janet Blackhorse, the Tohono O'odham Nation's environmental director, sat next to Dr. Amanda Foster from the University of Arizona's Archaeology Department. EPA Regional Administrator David Kim was reviewing documents with Senator Patricia Wells, who'd flown in from Washington specifically for this announcement. But the most significant presence in the room was Maria Santos, the investigative journalist from the Arizona Republic, who'd broken the story about Morrison Blake and Associates' legal violations. Her series of articles about corporate environmental responsibility had sparked a statewide review of development practices and led to new state legislation requiring mandatory federal consultation for large-scale projects. Judge Hawkins entered the room with the measured pace that had become familiar during the original proceedings. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to announce the establishment of the Patterson Center for Cultural and Environmental Preservation, but more importantly, to discuss how this project has become a model for environmental justice nationwide. She gestured to a series of charts and photographs displayed around the room. Dr. Chen, would you please brief us on the current status of the remediation effort? Dr. Chen stood and moved to a large map showing the 47-acre site. As of yesterday, Henderson Environmental Solutions has completed soil treatment on 18 acres. The contamination levels in the treated areas have dropped by 92%, exceeding all EPA projections. She pointed to different colored sections of the map. The archaeological preservation area has been completely isolated from contaminated zones, allowing Dr. Foster's team to begin excavation of the Hohokam settlement. What they've discovered has exceeded all expectations. Dr. Foster took over the presentation. General Patterson, when you first told us about this site, we anticipated finding a typical Hohokam village. What we've actually uncovered is a major regional center, with evidence of complex trade networks, advanced agricultural techniques, and social structures that we're still trying to understand. She pulled out a series of photographs showing carefully excavated structures. These aren't just dwelling sites. They're sophisticated community planning layouts that include irrigation systems, ceremonial spaces, and what appears to be an ancient environmental management complex. Janet Blackhorse nodded approvingly. Our tribal historians have been working with Dr. Foster's team, and we believe this site represents one of the most important cultural centers in our ancestral territory. The fact that it's being preserved as part of an environmental cleanup makes it even more significant. Senator Wells looked up from the documents she'd been reviewing. Dr. Chen, I understand that this project has attracted national attention. Can you explain why? Senator, the Patterson Center represents the first time in U.S. history that a Superfund site has been simultaneously developed as an archaeological preserve, environmental education center, and corporate responsibility showcase. We're receiving requests from environmental agencies in 12 other states asking to replicate this model. Marcus Henderson spoke up from his position at the far end of the table. Senator, what makes this project unique is that it's financially sustainable. The environmental remediation techniques we've developed here are so effective that other companies are paying us to apply them to their contaminated sites. We're turning environmental cleanup into a profitable business model. The implications were staggering. Henderson Environmental Solutions had essentially created a new industry. Private companies that could profitably clean up industrial contamination while creating community resources. Maria Santos looked up from her notepad. General Patterson, there's something I'd like to ask about the original court proceedings. Several people have wondered how you knew so much about Morrison, Blake, and Associates' internal communications. Was the Army conducting surveillance on the law firm? The question cut through the room's celebratory atmosphere. Everyone turned to look at me, and I could see the curiosity in their expressions. The truth was more complex than anyone had realized. Ms. Santos, the Army wasn't conducting surveillance on Morrison, Blake, and Associates, but we were monitoring all communications related to the Henderson property because of its strategic importance. Judge Hawkins frowned. Strategic importance? General, you've never mentioned that aspect of this case. I'd been waiting 3 months for this question, knowing that eventually someone would dig deep enough to uncover the full scope of the government's interest in this land. Your Honor, the Henderson property sits above one of the largest underground aquifers in the Southwest. The Hohokam settlement we discovered was built there specifically because of the water resources. But the modern strategic importance relates to national security. Dr. Chen looked surprised. General, you never mentioned national security implications during our environmental assessments. Dr. Chen, the contamination we found wasn't just industrial waste from Phoenix Industrial Solutions. During our excavation, we also discovered evidence of illegal dumping by defense contractors in the 1980s. Some of the contamination includes materials that were classified as national security concerns. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Defense contractors meant federal jurisdiction that went far beyond environmental protection. Senator Wells leaned forward. General, are you telling us that this site contains classified materials? Not anymore, Senator. The classified materials were removed during the first phase of Henderson's cleanup operation. But their presence is why the Army maintained oversight of this property for 38 years. We weren't just protecting an archaeological site or monitoring environmental contamination. We were ensuring that sensitive materials didn't end up in private hands. Marcus Henderson looked stunned. Generally, when my company was doing soil excavation, we found some metal containers that your team immediately removed. You told us they were industrial waste samples. Mr. Henderson, those containers held material that posed both environmental and national security risks. Your company's cleanup operation actually solved two federal problems simultaneously: environmental remediation and classified material recovery. Maria Santos was scribbling frantically. Generally, this means the federal government was using the archaeological designation and environmental concerns to maintain control over potentially sensitive materials. Ms. Santos, the federal government was using every legal tool available to protect both cultural resources and national security interests. The fact that we were able to accomplish both goals while also addressing environmental justice concerns represents the kind of comprehensive solution that government agencies rarely achieve. Judge Hawkins studied the documents in front of her with new understanding. General, this explains why you were so well informed about every aspect of this case. You weren't just representing archaeological interests, you were coordinating a multi-agency operation. That's correct, Your Honor. The Department of Defense, EPA, Interior Department, and Bureau of Indian Affairs had been working together on this site for decades. The Henderson lawsuit simply provided the legal framework we needed to implement a permanent solution. Dr. Foster looked thoughtful. General, does this mean that the Hohokam settlement was deliberately chosen by your agencies as a preservation strategy? Dr. Foster, the Hohokam settlement is absolutely authentic and culturally significant. But yes, the archaeological designation provided legal protection that served multiple federal interests. The tribal sovereignty agreements we negotiated ensured that the site will remain under federal protection indefinitely. Janet Blackhorse smiled. General, you're telling us that preserving our ancestral lands also protected national security and solved environmental problems. From our perspective, that sounds like the way the government should work. Senator Wells gathered her papers and stood. General Patterson, I came here today expecting to attend a simple ceremony for an environmental cleanup project. Instead, I've learned about one of the most sophisticated interagency operations I've encountered in 20 years in Washington. She looked around the room at the assembled group. What you've accomplished here isn't just environmental remediation or cultural preservation or national security protection. It's a demonstration of how the government can work when agencies coordinate effectively and include community stakeholders in the solution. As the meeting concluded and people began filing out of the conference room, Marcus Henderson approached me one final time. General, I have to ask, if my company hadn't filed that lawsuit, would any of this have happened? Would the site have remained contaminated indefinitely? I considered his question carefully. Mr. Henderson, your lawsuit forced us to act publicly on a situation we'd been managing quietly for 4 decades. Sometimes it takes legal pressure to transform government management into community solutions. As I walked out of the federal courthouse for what might be the last time, I reflected on how much had changed since that morning when security guards had laughed at my uniform. The Patterson Center would open to the public in 18 months, providing environmental education, cultural preservation, and a model for corporate responsibility that was already being studied by agencies across the country. But perhaps most importantly, a piece of poisoned land that had threatened a community for 45 years would finally be healed, protected, and transformed into something that served the people it had once endangered. 18 months later, I stood on an elevated platform overlooking the Patterson Center for Cultural and Environmental Preservation, watching as the final construction crews put finishing touches on what had once been 47 acres of poisoned earth. The transformation was breathtaking. Where toxic soil had once threatened Phoenix's water supply, terraced gardens now showcased native desert plants that had been carefully selected to continue the natural remediation process. The opening ceremony was scheduled to begin in 2 hours, but I'd arrived early to witness something I'd been planning for nearly 4 decades. Today wasn't just about celebrating environmental restoration or cultural preservation. It was about revealing the final piece of a puzzle that had shaped my entire military career. Dr. Amanda Foster approached from the archaeological pavilion, her face glowing with excitement. General Patterson, I wanted to show you something before the ceremony begins. We've made a discovery that changes everything we thought we knew about this site. She led me down a carefully constructed walkway that wound through the preserved excavation areas. The Hohokam settlement had been transformed into an open-air museum, with glass-covered viewing areas that allowed visitors to see the ancient structures while protecting them from the elements. Generally, when we first began excavating, we assumed we were uncovering a typical regional village. But the more we've studied the layout and artifacts, the more we've realized that this site represents something unprecedented in southwestern archaeology. Quote, "We stopped at a central viewing platform that overlooked the largest excavated structure, a circular building with sophisticated stone channels radiating outward in all directions. This isn't just a ceremonial center," Dr. Foster continued. "It's an ancient environmental management complex. The Hohokam didn't just live here. They were actively managing water resources, soil composition, and even air quality for an area that extended for hundreds of miles. I studied the intricate stone channels and carefully placed rock formations. Dr. Foster, are you saying this site was designed for environmental control?" General, the Hohokam built this complex around 900 AD to monitor and manage environmental conditions across much of what is now central Arizona. They had systems for detecting soil contamination, tracking groundwater flow, and even measuring air quality. When European diseases and climate change disrupted their civilization, this knowledge was lost for over 1,000 years. The implications were staggering. The land that had been poisoned by 20th century industrial waste had originally been chosen by an ancient civilization specifically because of its environmental management capabilities. Dr. Foster, does this mean the Hohokam would have been able to detect the contamination that Phoenix Industrial Solutions caused? Not only detect it, General, they would have been able to clean it up. We found evidence that they developed sophisticated bioremediation techniques using native plants and microorganisms. Some of the species they cultivated are still growing here naturally, and they've been actively removing toxins from the soil for the past 45 years. Marcus Henderson emerged from the administrative building, now wearing a suit instead of the hard hat that had become his trademark over the past year and a half. Henderson Environmental Solutions had grown into a nationally recognized company with contracts in 17 states and a reputation for innovative cleanup techniques that often surpassed federal standards. "General, I wanted to talk to you before the ceremony," he said, but his expression was troubled rather than celebratory. "We've received some information that I think you need to know about." Dr. Foster excused herself to continue preparing for the opening ceremony, leaving Henderson and me alone on the observation platform. "Marcus, what's wrong? The project has exceeded every expectation. Your company is profitable, the site is clean, and the cultural preservation has been a tremendous success." Henderson pulled out his phone and showed me a news article from that morning's Washington Post. The headline read, "Pentagon Inspector General launches investigation into multi-decade cover-up of classified material disposal." General, someone leaked information about the classified materials we removed from this site. The Pentagon IG is asking questions about why the Army maintained control over contaminated land for 38 years without informing Congress or the public. I read through the article quickly. An unnamed source had provided detailed information about defense contractor waste disposal in the 1980s, classified material recovery during Henderson's cleanup operation, and the Army's coordination with multiple federal agencies to maintain control over the site. Marcus, this investigation was always a possibility. What matters is that we accomplished what needed to be done. The site is clean, the cultural resources are preserved, and your company has developed remediation techniques that are being used nationwide. But General, the article suggests that the Army may have violated federal disclosure laws by not informing Congress about the classified materials. There's talk of congressional hearings, potential criminal charges for government officials, and questions about whether the entire Patterson Center project was built on an illegal foundation. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with an urgent message from Pentagon headquarters. I was being recalled to Washington immediately for questioning by the Inspector General's office. Henderson saw my expression change. "General, what does this mean for the center, for the opening ceremony, for everything we've built here?" "Marcus, it means that the final chapter of this story is just beginning." 2 hours later, as guests began arriving for the Patterson Center opening ceremony, I stood at a podium facing an audience that included tribal leaders, environmental scientists, government officials, and dozens of families whose children would benefit from the educational programs we'd developed. But I also noticed several people with press credentials who weren't from local media outlets, and at least 3 individuals who had the unmistakable bearing of federal investigators. Senator Patricia Wells, who had returned from Washington for the ceremony, approached the podium with a prepared statement. But instead of the celebratory remarks everyone expected, her expression was grave. Ladies and gentlemen, I need to address recent developments that have raised questions about the Patterson Center project. This morning, the Pentagon Inspector General's office announced a formal investigation into potential violations of federal disclosure laws related to this site. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Janet Blackhorse, representing the Tohono O'odham Nation, looked concerned. Dr. Chen from the EPA was frantically checking her phone for updates. However, Senator Wells continued, I want to be clear about something. Regardless of the ongoing investigation, this project represents one of the most successful examples of environmental restoration and cultural preservation in American history. The work that has been accomplished here will continue, and the center will open as scheduled. She gestured toward me. General Patterson has been asked to appear before congressional committees to explain the Army's actions over the past 4 decades. But I want everyone here to understand that his dedication to protecting both environmental resources and cultural heritage has been unwavering throughout his career. As I approached the podium, I could see the confusion and concern in the faces of people who had worked tirelessly to make this project successful. They deserved to know the truth, not just about the recent investigation, but about the complete story of why this land had been so carefully protected for so many years. Ladies and gentlemen, I began. When I walked into that federal courthouse 19 months ago, many of you assumed I was just another military officer trying to assert federal authority over a local development dispute. Today I want to tell you the real reason I've spent my entire career protecting this land. I paused, looking out over the crowd toward the ancient Hohokam structures that were now permanently preserved under federal protection. In 1987, when I was a young captain with the Army Corps of Engineers, I was assigned to investigate reports of illegal dumping on this property. What I found wasn't just industrial contamination. It was evidence of a systematic effort by defense contractors to dispose of classified materials in civilian locations. The crowd had grown completely silent. Even the investigators were listening intently. But I also found something else. I found evidence that an ancient civilization had chosen this exact location for environmental management purposes over 1,000 years ago. The Hohokam had built sophisticated systems here to monitor and control environmental conditions across hundreds of miles. I gestured toward Dr. Foster, who was standing near the archaeological pavilion. What Dr. Foster's team has discovered over the past 18 months confirms what I suspected back in 1987. This site represents a convergence of ancient environmental wisdom and modern environmental challenges. The Hohokam were environmental scientists. They understood something about this land that we're only beginning to appreciate. Marcus Henderson was nodding, finally understanding why I had been so determined to preserve the site rather than simply facilitate its development. The classified materials that were dumped here in the 1980s weren't just a national security problem. They were an environmental threat that could have contaminated water supplies for millions of people. The Army's decision to maintain control over this land for 4 decades wasn't a cover-up. It was a long-term strategy to find a solution that served environmental protection, cultural preservation, and national security simultaneously. Senator Wells looked surprised. General, are you saying that the Army planned this outcome from the beginning? Senator, the Army planned to protect this land until we could find a way to clean it up properly and permanently. What we couldn't have planned was finding someone like Marcus Henderson, who was willing to transform his family's legacy of environmental damage into a model for environmental restoration. I turned to address Henderson directly. Marcus, your father's company poisoned this land 45 years ago. But your company has not only cleaned up that contamination, you've developed techniques that are now being used to clean up similar sites across the country. You've turned your family's environmental crimes into environmental solutions. The crowd began to applaud, but I held up my hand in silence. The Pentagon investigation will determine whether the Army followed proper procedures in managing this situation. But I can tell you that every decision we made over the past 4 decades was motivated by a simple principle. This land needed protection until someone could figure out how to heal it properly. Quote, I looked out over the terraced gardens, the preserved archaeological structures, and the educational facilities that would serve generations of students. Today, that healing is complete. The Patterson Center represents proof that environmental damage can be reversed, that ancient wisdom can inform modern solutions, and that government agencies can work together to serve community interests rather than bureaucratic convenience. As I stepped away from the podium, Agent General Torres from the Environmental Crimes Unit approached me with a serious expression. General Patterson, I have a message from the Inspector General's office. Your testimony in Washington has been postponed indefinitely. I looked at him with surprise. Postponed? Why? Agent Torres smiled. Because 3 hours ago, the President announced that the Patterson Center model is being implemented at 57 contaminated sites nationwide. Congress has approved emergency funding for a new federal program based on the techniques you've developed here. He handed me an official document bearing the presidential seal. General, instead of being investigated for potential violations, you're being asked to lead the National Environmental Restoration Initiative. Congratulations. You've just been promoted to a job that doesn't technically exist yet. 2 years after that transformative day in federal court, I stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, wearing the same dress blues that security guards had once mocked as a costume. This time, however, the ribbons on my chest included the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States. President Catherine Martinez stepped to the podium, addressing an audience that included environmental leaders, tribal representatives, congressional members, and the team that had made the Patterson Center a reality. But the ceremony wasn't just about recognizing past achievements. It was about announcing a transformation in how America approaches environmental challenges. Ladies and gentlemen, President Martinez began, 2 years ago, a single lawsuit in Phoenix, Arizona uncovered a web of environmental contamination, cultural destruction, and governmental complexity that had been festering for nearly half a century. Today, we're here to celebrate how that crisis became the foundation for the most ambitious environmental restoration program in American history. Quote, she gestured toward a series of displays showing before and after photographs from contaminated sites across the country. The National Environmental Restoration Initiative, led by General Patterson, has successfully cleaned up contaminated land in 34 states. But more importantly, it has proven that environmental restoration can be economically profitable, culturally respectful, and scientifically innovative. Marcus Henderson sat in the front row, now recognized as one of the country's leading environmental entrepreneurs. Henderson Environmental Solutions employed over 800 people across 19 states, and their cleanup techniques had been adopted by companies worldwide. But perhaps more significantly, Marcus had used his company's profits to establish the Henderson Foundation for Environmental Justice, which provided funding for community-led cleanup efforts in low-income areas. Mr. Henderson, President Martinez continued, your company's transformation from failed real estate development to environmental restoration leadership demonstrates how American entrepreneurship can serve environmental justice. Your family's story, from causing environmental damage to leading environmental solutions, represents the kind of redemption that our democracy makes possible. Dr. Rebecca Chen from the EPA was also in attendance, having been promoted to Assistant Administrator for Environmental Restoration. The techniques developed at the Patterson Center had become standard EPA protocols, and the success of the public-private partnership model had influenced environmental policy nationwide. But the most moving presence was Janet Blackhorse, representing the Tohono O'odham Nation, who had traveled from Arizona with a delegation of tribal elders. The Patterson Center had become a model for how federal agencies could work with tribal governments to protect cultural resources while addressing environmental challenges. General Patterson, President Martinez said, turning toward me, when you walked into that Phoenix courtroom in your military dress uniform, onlookers saw someone who appeared to be out of place. They had no idea they were witnessing someone who had spent 4 decades developing a comprehensive solution to some of our most complex environmental and cultural challenges. She paused, looking out over the assembled crowd. What General Patterson understood, and what took the rest of us years to appreciate, is that environmental problems, cultural preservation, and national security interests don't have to be competing priorities. They can be complementary solutions. As I approached the podium to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom, I thought about the extraordinary journey that had brought us to this moment. The pathway from a single contentious lawsuit to a national environmental program had been neither planned nor predictable, but it had demonstrated something crucial about American problem-solving capacity. Mr. President, distinguished guests, I began, this medal belongs not to me, but to everyone who refused to accept that environmental damage was permanent, that cultural destruction was inevitable, or that government agencies couldn't work together effectively. I looked out over the audience, recognizing faces from every stage of the Patterson Center story: scientists, lawyers, tribal leaders, entrepreneurs, and government officials who had transformed conflict into collaboration. When I first learned about the contamination at the Henderson site in 1987, I was a young officer who believed that military protocol and environmental protection were separate responsibilities. It took me 38 years to understand that they were actually the same mission: protecting the resources that communities depend on for survival and prosperity. Marcus Henderson was nodding, remembering our first confrontation in that Phoenix courtroom where he'd seen me as an obstacle to his development plans. Mr. Henderson, your willingness to transform your company's mission when presented with new information demonstrates the kind of adaptive thinking that environmental challenges require. You could have fought the federal restrictions, filed appeals, and spent years in litigation. Instead, you chose to become part of the solution. I turned toward Janet Blackhorse and the tribal delegation. Ms. Blackhorse, the Tohono O'odham Nation's partnership in this project has shown how traditional ecological knowledge can inform modern environmental restoration. The Hohokam environmental management techniques that Dr. Foster's team discovered have influenced cleanup strategies at sites across the country. Dr. Chen stood and applauded as I continued. Dr. Chen, the EPA's willingness to embrace innovative public-private partnerships has created a model that's being studied by environmental agencies worldwide. The Patterson Center demonstrates that federal environmental protection can be economically sustainable and community beneficial. President Martinez rejoined me at the podium. General Patterson, I understand that you have an announcement to make about the future of the National Environmental Restoration Initiative. I nodded, reaching into my jacket for a document that represented the culmination of 5 decades of military and environmental service. Mr. President, I'm announcing my retirement from active military duty effective next month. However, I'm also announcing the establishment of the Patterson Institute for Environmental Solutions, a non-profit organization that will continue developing innovative approaches to environmental restoration. The audience erupted in applause, but I wasn't finished. The Patterson Institute will be headquartered at the original Patterson Center in Phoenix, where it will serve as both a research facility and a training center for the next generation of environmental restoration professionals. We're partnering with universities in 12 states to develop degree programs in environmental restoration engineering. Marcus Henderson stood up, smiling broadly. General Henderson Environmental Solutions is proud to announce that we're donating our entire patent portfolio for environmental cleanup technologies to the Patterson Institute. These techniques should be available to anyone working on environmental restoration, not limited to companies that can afford licensing fees. The gesture was unprecedented in the environmental industry. Henderson was essentially giving away intellectual property worth hundreds of millions of dollars to ensure that cleanup techniques could be used by communities and organizations regardless of their financial resources. President Martinez looked genuinely moved. Mr. Henderson, this donation represents the kind of corporate responsibility that environmental challenges require. You're ensuring that profitable environmental solutions can also serve environmental justice. Dr. Chen approached the podium with her own announcement. Mr. President, the EPA is establishing a new grant program that will provide funding for community-based environmental restoration projects. The Patterson Model grants will support local organizations working on contaminated sites in underserved communities. Janet Blackhorse was the final speaker, representing not just the Tohono O'odham Nation but a coalition of tribal governments from across the Southwest. General Patterson, President Martinez, The tribal nations of the Southwest want to announce the establishment of the Indigenous Environmental Knowledge Network. We're sharing traditional ecological wisdom with environmental restoration projects nationwide, ensuring that ancient knowledge informs modern solutions. As the ceremony concluded and guests began moving toward the White House reception, I found myself standing with the core team that had transformed a contentious lawsuit into a national environmental program. General, Marcus Henderson said, "I have to ask, when you walked into that courtroom 2 years ago, did you envision any of this?" I considered his question carefully. "Marcus, I envisioned a solution to a 40-year-old problem. I had no idea that the solution would become a model for addressing similar problems nationwide." Dr. Chen joined our conversation. "General, what's next for environmental restoration? What challenges should we be preparing for?" Dr. Chen, the techniques we've developed can address contamination that's already occurred. But the real challenge is preventing future contamination while maintaining economic growth and development. That's going to require the kind of innovative thinking that we've developed over the past 2 years. Janet Blackhorse smiled. "Generally, the tribal nations have been working on sustainable development for centuries. Maybe it's time for everyone else to learn from approaches that have proven successful over much longer timeframes." As I walked through the White House corridors toward my final Pentagon briefing, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had begun, with security guards laughing at my military uniform. The Patterson Center had become a symbol of how environmental challenges could be addressed through collaboration rather than confrontation, innovation rather than litigation, and community partnership rather than government mandate. But perhaps most importantly, it has demonstrated that complex problems often require comprehensive solutions that address multiple challenges simultaneously. Environmental restoration, cultural preservation, economic development, and national security had proven to be complementary rather than competing objectives. The young captain who had discovered contaminated land in 1987 could never have imagined that 4 decades later, that discovery would influence environmental policy nationwide. But the general who received the Presidential Medal of Freedom understood that the most important environmental solutions often take generations to implement properly. As I prepared to begin the next chapter of my career at the Patterson Institute, I knew that the work was far from finished. There were thousands of contaminated sites across the country, hundreds of communities struggling with environmental challenges, and countless opportunities to apply the lessons we'd learned in Phoenix to problems that hadn't yet been addressed. The dress blues that had once been mocked as a costume had become symbols of how military discipline, environmental science, and community partnership could create solutions that served multiple generations. And the land that had once threatened Phoenix's water supply had become proof that even the most damaged environments could be restored to health and productivity. Sometimes justice comes in the form of a court ruling, sometimes it comes in the form of a medal and a ceremony. But most often it comes in the form of contaminated land becoming clean, poisoned water becoming pure, and damaged communities becoming healthy again. The Patterson Center would continue serving environmental education and cultural preservation for generations to come, and the model we'd developed would continue spreading to communities across the country, proving that America's most complex challenges often contain the seeds of America's most innovative solutions. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.